cost is obviously something we have to discuss because cost is a huge factor in every clinical trial, but also, I believe, a big factor in the growth of clinical trials in the APAC region. Estimates that I have seen, and I'm sure there's many different studies on this, but estimates I have seen place that cost to be 30 to 40% less than in the US and Europe. And I'm sure a lot of folks are probably wondering what is primarily responsible for that cost differential. So Brad, I'm going to go ahead and start with you again this time. And I realize you're primarily located in Australia, but can you tell us anything about the cost differences there versus perhaps doing a trial in other regions?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up here was the Australian R&D tax incentive scheme. So that provides up to a 43.5% back as a refundable R&D tax offset of eligible R&D expenditure. Now, if you have less than $20 million in turnover, you get that back in cash at the end of the financial year. If you have more than $20 million in turnover, then it's a non-refundable amount that offsets future tax payable. So like all government schemes, there are a number of requirements that need to be met, including that the eligible R&D activity is undertaken in Australia. So again, that's one of the primary reasons why companies should be looking to Australia to undertake their clinical trials. So just briefly, there is a few steps that need to be completed in order to access this R&D. So the first one is the preparation of an annual report, which is lodged with AusIndustry. Now, AusIndustry is an Australian government body, and basically their role is to confirm that the R&D that is undertaken is eligible. Now, once you've received the all clear, information regarding your actual R&D expenditure is processed in your tax return. And again, assuming you have less than $20 million in turnover, that R&D expenditure, that R&D amount will then, 43.5 up to 43.5%, will end up being deposited back into your bank account. Now, separately, also in relation to your question, Ed, one of the things that we have seen is that, yes, between Australia and the US, when we've been budgeting our studies, we have seen that the cost in Australia is about 30 to 40% less. And that pretty much spans the entire process from central labs to local labs to hospital and doctor costs. We pretty much see across the board there is about a 30% reduction, generally speaking, for all of those services.
And just out of curiosity, how long has that tax incentive been around, and is this something you expect is going to continue into the future?
Yes, so as far as I'm aware, we have been accessing this R&D scheme for well over 10 years. It is something that the Australian government has continued to support. There is some changes made from time to time, but certainly AusIndustry and the government is wanting to make sure that Australia has a vibrant life sciences community, as well as having a vibrant clinical trials community. So it is something that I think will be existing into the foreseeable future, and both sides of our government are very much supportive of the scheme.
And Michael, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on clinical costs in APAC. Are the estimates you're seeing similar to the numbers I mentioned, and is this something we can expect to continue?
Yeah, I think, as you brought up, cost is certainly a factor. The FTE rates in China, in particular, are highly competitive, but most of the experts that I talk to in the region report that the real differences are found in the actual trial costs of data management, biostatistics, some of the lab testing, and the bioanalytics. Certainly, as most of these APAC countries have come up to speed, and now, Sarah will certainly be more attuned to alignment with ICH guidelines, but the streamlining of the processes, the alignment with what the rest of the world, in particular the West, is doing, has now allowed those sponsors who are trying to do global trials to be able to avoid having to, replicate the same trial, but to do that necessarily in regional populations, because a lot of the, the global data is now acceptable. So I think there's certainly over the last, 5 years or so, I think there's been a dramatic change. And, my thoughts are, instead of looking at Asia as essentially one of these emerging parts of the world, to recognize that they are now very much so mainstream in a lot of the activities that they do. There's still some idiosyncrasies, obviously, in working in APAC, but by and large, you're starting to see a lot more cost efficiencies come into play, and that along are coupled with the lower FTE rates to begin with because of the vast number of labor resources that are there, really makes this a very cost-effective approach. You can't be an absentee landlord, but you can certainly achieve a tremendous amount of cost efficiency.
Yes, and when you and I spoke a few days ago, I know you mentioned the possibility of the cost differentials closing ranks. Can you share some thoughts on why you think that might happen and when we might expect to see that happen?
Well, by that, what we were talking about largely is the fact that, yes, to get into the market, I think things have been pretty much so very economical, but certainly, the market equilibration that's going to happen with Asia is rapidly going to take place, especially in a time when we are experiencing such supply chain issues. The reality is, I fully expect the cost of doing trials in Asia to more closely replicate what you're seeing around the world here over the next few years. I don't know what my colleagues on the panel may have different views here, but that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there and respond to Michael's comment as well, because I think that you're very much right, Michael. I think that there is a lot of CROs in the region that are very much centralizing their support services. So although a lot of the major CROs do have presence in Australia, a lot of their Australian presence is related to project management, to monitoring, and it's not necessarily related to data management or statistics, which they are generally trying to centralize, partly in lower cost regions. So I think, again, that's going to be something where when Australia does become more expensive, and it certainly is becoming more expensive as time goes by, there will be ways of trying to keep that cost down by looking at using that centralized model where some of those services are provided outside of Australia and in a lower cost of living region.